we could put people in this room together for 5 minutes and we can come up with a vision of an alternative economy. We know what it looks like. We know what we want from an alternative economy. Rather, I'm going to focus on an approach or a model that can maybe help us get closer to that alternative vision. So I thought I'd begin with an outline of the economy that we currently live under, and we have lived under for the last 40 years, which is an economy based increasingly on extraction. The rich aren't rich because they're particularly talented or intelligent. In fact, if you meet some of them, a lot of them are very thick. But it's because they've been allowed to drain what wealth there is within society outwards, out of the real economy, out of the public sector, out of our communities, out of the hands of workers. It's the very definition of parasitic. That's the economy we live under. And the concepts of unearned income, this is about as theoretical as I'll get, so don't worry. Of unearned income and accumulation by dispossession best capture the logic of this model, where capitalists don't really produce anything anymore. They don't produce things to sell for a profit and then workers get a wee slice of it. But instead they just take control of existing public goods, services, assets, land and so on, and then they charge us for the privilege of accessing them. So the main features of this: privatisation, we've talked about that, of transport, water, infrastructure, healthcare, all public goods handed over to private interests. Then they install a toll booth on it and charge us for using it, and we have to pay them because we can't do without those things. The example of housing, of course, we don't build social housing anymore. It's been handed over to the private sector, and what happens is private developers build a load of houses, they sell them to big landlords, often institutional landlords, who haven't produced anything new, but now have an asset and they rent to us for an extortionate amount, and then they sell on at a later date for an inflated value. You have the redistribution of wealth through the state, and that's tax breaks, tax havens, corporate welfare, which we've seen in the last few years, trillions of dollars of public money handed over, created out of thin air, by the way, magic, and handed over to the corporate sector without any conditions attached. And what do? They don't use it for investment in new technology, they don't use it for investment in their workforce. They use it to inflate stock prices, to pay dividends, and to pay CEOs. We've also seen the emergence of a powerful finance sector that no longer funds productive investment, doesn't lend money to people who make things anymore. What they do is they exist to profit from pure speculation, making money from money, and exploiting our misery, of course. And all this is taking place in parallel with the continued dispossession of indigenous peoples in the global south, and the continued extraction of finite natural resources in pursuit of infinite economic growth and profit. And that's what Sean's going to talk about, so I'll not weigh into that too much. So that's the extractive model, and this is what it's given us. I'll not spend too much time on this. We all know we're in a cost of living crisis. Poverty and destitution's on the rise. There are 1 million people in Britain and the north in destitution, which is unforgivable. We're living in a time of extreme wealth inequality. The richest 1% own over half of the world's wealth. They've doubled their wealth in the last couple of years due to those corporate handouts, by 8 trillion, I think it was. We're seeing falling wages at their lowest levels in 30 years. Someone's done the calculation, someone's much smarter than me. Workers in Britain and the north here have lost a collective 300 billion in the last 20 to 30 years. And just from the wages being stripped away and going to profits. And as I say, like energy companies, retailers, you name it, are all recording record profits at the moment. We're facing another wave of austerity to compound the effects of austerity that have already been talked about. 30 billion in the next 5 years, which is the equivalent of the last round of austerity. And it's to satisfy the markets. which is code for the most powerful section of the ruling class, and the sitting city of London, if you're interested in finding them. And finally, it's given us a climate and a climate and ecological emergency, which Sean, of course, is going to talk about. So that's the extractive model, and some people say the economy is broken and so on. It's not broken. It's working perfectly well for the people who are being enriched by it, the 1% and the City of London. So part of the challenge for us is that our enemies are in power in Westminster, in Leinster House, and so on. But not just in government, they're in power in the institutions of the economy, the banks, the financial institutions, and so on. So these centres of power will have to be confronted and they'll have to be defeated politically. I'm still hopeful of a revolutionary breakthrough at some point. Hopeful but not optimistic, which involves a move to a socialist republic on this island. But in the meantime, what can we do to take control of our own destinies and to make that transition easier? And this is where community wealth building sort of comes in. The starting point of it is that there's no one coming to save us, but we can use existing resources and levers to disrupt that process of wealth extraction and put in place new economic institutions and practices. And it looks to do so by hardwiring economic and social, economic and ecological justice in the local economies by design. So it's not waiting for wealth to accumulate at the top, but it's designing the economy in a way that it meets these sort of objectives by default in the natural operation of the economy. There's a longer pre-history of community wealth building, which I don't really have time to get into. I'll skip by that. It goes back to Youngstown and Cleveland in Ohio, which was the deindustrialised Rust Belt of the US. Some of you might have heard the story. It's a really interesting, inspirational story, and I'd encourage people to read up about it. But just for the purposes of this, let's pretend that it started here. Closer to home, I suppose, in Preston in 2012. So Preston was a city totally ravaged by austerity and neoliberalism. It was faced with the collapse of a major commercial development. Investors had pulled out, a sort of Tribeca type of development, and they're up shit creek. And a Labour councillor by the name of Matthew Brown, he was inspired by the Cleveland experience, and he was searching around for new or a different approach. He recognised that the city still had a number of what they call anchor institutions. So that's public institutions that are rooted in place, they're not going anywhere, and they have significant spending power. So what Matthew Brown did, and his team, was convince 6 of those anchor institutions, including the council, to spend locally where they could, to try to localise whatever money they had, and prevent any leakage from the local economy. Within the first 5 years, these institutions had increased their spend by 75 million in Preston and 200 million in the Lancashire area. Unemployment was halved. They had a major increase in living wage employment. Poverty was cut. Preston moved out of the top 20% deprived cities. It was named the most improved city to work and live in, just by doing that. And then, I'm not trying to explain this diagram because your heads will explode, but gradually what they did was they began with this progressive procurement model, which is what it's called, and from that they gradually put in place the elements of a more integrated sort of strategy and ecosystem. So they brought other anchor institutions into play, they convinced them to do the same with their spending. They convinced the local government pension fund to redirect 100 million of its fund into local economic development and community projects. They started introducing bespoke supports for cooperatives to try to grow that sector. They expanded the role of credit unions, they established a community bank, and then they began looking at municipal and community renewable energy projects. So they did all that, and that sort of came together as a strategy, and they tried to make sure that each element of the strategy supported another. On the basis of the Preston model, the Preston experience, community wealth building has been formally adopted in dozens of municipalities, and at least a couple of national governments. Has even made its way to Native American territories in the US and to Colombia. We're currently working with the FARC to develop a community wealth building strategy, which is bizarre for us, but it's a growing movement. It's gaining momentum, and it's catching people's attention. After years of banging our heads against the brick wall about the need for proper supports to develop a cooperative sector here in the north, we finally managed to convince Deirdre Hargey to take community wealth building. She had a real interest in it herself when she was a councillor, and we convinced her to take it with her in the Department of Communities whenever she became Minister. She commissioned a body of work to explore what community wealth building would look like in our context, and we were working to help develop those sort of proposals. And community wealth building will look differently in the north of Ireland than it does in Preston, certainly than it does in Colombia or other parts of the world. But it's really looked to advance each of these principles or pillars as part of a full-fat sort of integrated approach. So I'm just going to run through very quickly some of the things that we could be looking at here in the north, and we can be looking at. It's within our gift to do so. That's what we're focusing on. Under each pillar, it's progressive procurement. The executive departments alone spend $3 billion a year on buying goods and services. Now, if you think of the impact that would have if they were to localise that spending, ensure a bare minimum leaked out of the local economy. They localise it, they build local, shorter supply chains made up of small and medium enterprises, community businesses, social enterprises, co-ops, worker-owned businesses, and so on, displacing the big corporate firms, keeping wealth within those communities, and reducing the amount that is going to absentee shareholders and their tax haven accounts in the Bahamas or wherever else. Fair employment and just labour markets. So it's saying that the government and the public sector should be setting a standard on pay, job quality, decent working conditions, which some of them aren't at the moment. They should be using conditions in public contracts to set the same standards along supply chains. No company should receive a contract from the public sector if they're not paying a living wage and treating their workers fairly. Like that's a basic tenet. Like we should be building local labour markets to create good employment opportunities for people in deprived communities, including in green sectors. But we're also making the bigger point on top of this, that the Northern Executive has had employment, industrial relations law devolved for 25 years, and we haven't seen a single piece of progressive workers' legislation in that time. It's totally within their gift to introduce legislation that will strengthen the voice of workers and ensure that they're better equipped to deal with exploitative employers. So those are the types of things that we're saying. Socially just use of land and property. So this is about protecting, introducing legislation and policy to protect land and property from speculation, to prioritise its use for the common good, including social housing, community land trusts to prevent land from being speculated upon, and to strengthen the right of communities to challenge private developments and put forward their own proposals. Making financial power work for local places. We have a huge credit union sector here, 20 billion in assets. I think they hold. Over a third of the population is a member of a credit union, and they're very restricted in what they can do. They're not able to support the development of community businesses, of co-ops or whatever. So it's about supporting them to do that. Local government pension funds. Local government pension funds here are worth 8 billion, and it's invested in all sorts of shit that you wouldn't want it to be invested in. Arms, fossil fuels, you name it. That's what it's invested in. Like, so why can some of that be redirected towards local economic development? A big one, if you look at the hundreds of millions that Invest NI have spunked over the last 20 years, handing out the multinationals who stay here for 6 months, take the money, thank you very much, and then they fuck off, leaving the rest of us in the shit. So if you committed half of what they give the multinationals to local economic development in our communities, you think of what could be achieved. The establishment of a public bank to challenge the power of the big banks, to give people an option, a more ethical, community-focused and democratic option. So those are some of the things that we're saying could and should be done here, and it's totally within. We don't need permission from Westminster to do some of this stuff. It's totally within the gift of the executive. And then finally, and this is the main one for us, I suppose, central to community wealth building is the building of what they call plural ownership, but what we would like to call democratic ownership, a democratic economy, where more wealth and economic power is transferred into the hands of the collective. So whether that's through rebuilding the cooperative sector here and community businesses on the basis of traditions that exist here. This area that we're sitting in used to have a really strong cooperative tradition, and so it's about rebuilding those, putting in place the infrastructure and support for workers to take over the running of their businesses where they're on the verge of collapse or being sold, or where the owners retiring. If you remember a lot of you were there with the Harlan and Wolff dispute, that's exactly what the workers wanted to do. To take over, use their skills and knowledge and their expertise to move into the renewable energy sector and preserve the company and preserve those jobs, and they didn't have the support to do it. And there's dozens upon dozens of companies and sets of workers who are in the same position. Public and municipal ownership. Like, we have a real aversion here to public ownership, public enterprise, including in things like energy. It's just not on the cards, and yet it should be an option. So all of these things, and this is really what underpins a more radical approach to community wealth building. And I'll finish here. Owen, so you're coming to the rugby tax. And this is what really underpins a more radical approach to community wealth building. Democratic ownership, because a democratic economy is, by definition, it's more equal. It's one that's more resilient. It's one that harnesses our someone has mentioned this, our collective capacities, and knowledge and experiences that build solidarity. And these are all proven, and it's one that can be more easily directed to social needs and purposes, including the addressing the climate emergency. So community wealth building isn't a magic bullet by any means, but it's an approach, I think, that can help to address some of our more immediate problems and lay the foundations for longer term, more transformative change of the kind that Sean's going to talk about. So I think I'll leave it there.
Brilliant.
We may be able to hold it to one question or so just before we move on to Sean Ferran. But there was a lot there anyway that was amazing. Particularly some of the capitalist myths that you often hear. You know, I remember watching an interview of somebody, a representative of US Steel, and this was from years ago, before I was born, but I watched it. And he got up and he said to the press, and he said, US Steel is not in the interest of making steel. We're in the interest of making profits. And he said this, when he said that first, and I was like, he's going to say it, and he did. And it's the same here when you have BP or whoever supplies energy for us. They're not in the business of heating our homes, they're in the business of making profits.
On a rate bus there, you know, the money that was funneled from the church, from the bus company to the church that Invest NI gave, I don't know, I think there's due to be something coming out about that soon, but again, there's another, the workers were left in the shit because he'd been funneling the money that Invest NI invested in the business into his church, so it's just corrupt scandal, you know.
I mean, at best they create some 0-hour contract, low paid, precarious jobs for a few months and then they disappear, a lot of them. That's been the story of the last 20 years. It's hundreds of millions of public money wasted on it.
So, just practically, is there practical things that people who work in the community have limited amount of resources, but you've got buildings, with facilities, you know, is there practical things that the community people could be doing?
I think you're already doing it to a large extent. Like, you know, the community, the great thing about this community is that you have a really strong infrastructure. You're doing the sort of things that are generating and building the community well. I suppose one of the things, I think I had a conversation with yourself and Fergal a few years ago, like, and you're talking about a skills audit of the community, and that's like one practical thing that might form the basis of revitalising that old cooperative tradition that existed here, like looking at the skills that exist within this community and matching it to the future needs of the economy and society, like including in the green sector and so on. Like, so there's opportunities there, I think, but in large part, like, you're already doing it. Like, there's really strong foundations here for this kind of approach, because the organisations, the sort of collective, the sense of collectivism and so on already exists. Kieran?
So, you were talking that one earlier in the housing stuff, and the solutions were on the room in terms of what we need, and even in terms of at a general level, kind of party political level, on the general terms, parties would come out and say to support all this stuff. You know, to support their idea of a rate the house for everyone, to support the idea of kind of a just and equitable economy. It's just bridging the gap between general support and actually the policies. And I know, for instance, a number of years ago, the PPR had a campaign around procurement in Belfast City Council, trying to link the awarding of big contracts to try and address unemployment, so that a certain amount of people, you know, the work would be employed if, say, for instance, some company got a contract to build a road in the city or wherever it may be, that they had to employ a certain amount of people. So again, that's very much in keeping with what we would imagine, not all, but most of the parties at Belfast City Council support, but they couldn't bring themselves to bringing that through and actually implementing that immediately across the board. And just, you know, I probably we don't have this why that is, well, we all have ideas, but just what are your thoughts on that? How do we start to actually move beyond the general issue of support, the general kind of support around housing or the economy, to actually implement the practical measures that they've done in Preston?
Yeah, I mean, a huge part of it is political, well, you know. Belfast City Council was actually presented the opportunity to adopt what became the Preston model back in 2012, and they passed it up. And the reality is here that the institutions are very set in their ways and conservative. They're hard to turn, they're hard to shift. Part of it is presenting them with the evidence, part of it is making those common sense sort of reasoned arguments that we have. We can point to it and say that this works, and I think that's part of it, that it's sort of catching up with what's happening elsewhere, and they're saying, oh fuck, aye, that's worked there, and why don't we try that, despite the fact they've been told 10 years ago that it would work. The procurement thing is a prime example. You know, those social clauses and things exist for those big contracts. They are supposed to employ, they are supposed to provide decent employment for those who are like furthest from the labour market and so on, but the whole system's being gamed, totally being gamed by them. Part of it is because the social value sort of policies and legislation isn't really in place. It's not strong enough, and part of it is that it's just not being monitored, and there's no real accountability. You know, they'll bring someone on and get some young lad to push a brush around a site for 12 months and then send him on his way. Like, and that's just not good enough. So part of it is making the arguments. Part of it is those presenting them with the evidence. Like a lot of it has to the reality is a lot of it has to be put on a legislative basis, like, or else it's worth nothing. You know, a policy is worth nothing unless it's backed up by legislation. And the other part of it is just like we have to embarrass them and continue political. That's the only reason things change in a lot of instances with political pressure, and they get to the point where they're so embarrassed that they have to do something about it. Like, so that's going to be a big part of it.
Well, we're probably going to go on the Sean Byrne because we can bring some of this back anyway, just in case we want to continue the conversation. Because I'm sure some of it will be definitely out there, and you should.